start this trial on a law of induction deduction. This is the Internet Court of Truth. It allows people to bring something to a group of other people where the plaintiff, in this case me, is asserting something that he believes is true, and he wonders whether other people believe what he meant by truth. And then they give their verdicts as well, so he can see what other people think. And what I've been doing for the last few weeks, and probably will continue for numbers of weeks going forward, is bringing things to the court. I wrote them, and I've been learning how other people see stuff that I believe is true or stuff that I believe is a lie. And it's actually quite interesting to do that. Today, we're getting at the biggest segment of my entire life, which was 5 years getting a PhD in computational cognitive neuroscience at the University of Virginia. This is the basic finding of my PhD, which has everything to do with things like conspiracy theories and why people don't normally think logically. And it's difficult for people to think logically, even though their brain may not have fully analyzed that it's true for any number of reasons. But it turns out that the neural computation just works that way. So our brains, in fact, all neural systems are what Jeff Hinton calls intuition engines. What we're really good is at developing intuitions about what's true, what's not true. And what we're not so good at is doing all the work you have to do to prove something is logically true or not true. And most of the time, we don't even have access to the kind of data that would be required. Most people living their lives don't have the kind of access to the kind of data that they would actually need to prove whether something's true or a lie. So they have to rely on their intuition. This is a fact of neural computation. This is not an opinion. Just in the last week, I had a physicist spout some crazy stuff about truth and lies. And he said, your work is just your opinion. And so I sent him my PhD thesis and I said, this is not my opinion. So the PhD thesis makes a very simple statement. It says that, is it true that perceiving truths or lies inductively, in other words, directly perceiving something as true or a lie, inductively, is always faster than perceiving them deductively, which is by logic, by working through the logic and getting evidence and all the other stuff. Because the deductive steps are not done with a single perception or action. We tested this. This was 2.5 years worth of work for my dissertation, and numerous experiments on people doing these experiments. The real measure of brain computation here is speed. So the idea is that if you can do something as fast as you can hear it, and you can compute whether it's true or false, that's your brain is doing what it does, computing exactly as it normally does. If you take a long time to do something, if you take more time to do it, then your brain is able to do logic. There's no problem with it doing logic, except it's harder. And so it will slow down your response. And you see the things that brains compute directly by how fast people can respond essentially to a probe, a question. If they can respond really quickly, then my argument is they are not processing the thing logically. They're processing it intuitively. And they may know that it's true. That's not the issue. In other words, they may absolutely know that it's true, but it's still coming through their intuition mechanism. It's not coming through their logic mechanism. Usually you can tell that if they respond very quickly to something, and then you say, prove it, tell me why you believe it's true, and then they'll slow down. They'll come back and with other memories and other things that logically make it true. But what they were originally doing was just instantly using their memory system to intuit the truth. What we've built in these systems like ChatGPT, uh, DeepSeek, the Grok, and so forth, are systems that compute exactly the way we believe that human brains compute. We've been proven correct now that we have the machines that can do this. Building an intuition machine, once you have enough of the right kind of hardware, these are not computers. Once you have the right kind of hardware to do these computations that the human being does just routinely with its 100 billion neurons and 3,000 compute points for each neuron, 300 trillion computing units going off simultaneously. That's what really goes on. And you can't get this real time, near real time. It's milliseconds. People will know the answer to something. In fact, often they'll know the answer to something before the sentence completes. So somebody will start saying a sentence and they will be able to interrupt the person and know exactly what the person was fixing to say and then respond to them. And it's that fast. So we're talking an interesting factoid for most people who don't know is that a shift of attention, in other words, the time it takes a human being to shift his attention under optimal conditions. You hear a lightning bolt and you shift your attention. That basically takes about 50 milliseconds. The amount of time it takes to process sentences and for the memory system to actually kick in on a sentence and actually it's faster than attention can switch. And it's on the order of a few milliseconds delayed. In other words, you're picking up on things all the time that are only delayed by your brain by a few milliseconds, not 50, which is very quickly. And when you switch, you actually know what happened with the lightning hit. The fact that the lightning hit at that point in time when you just switched shows you that your brain was always listening out for lightning and knew what it was when it hit. And then your brain had to get you to switch your attention, which takes 50 milliseconds. So that's what we know from the science. What this PhD thesis did pretty much got me hired at Carnegie Mellon. It's called Formation of Causal Relations Between Sentences in Comprehension and Memory. Effectively, what I want to do is the thing that I'm calling the Thibadeau law, for want of a better term, is that an induction, in other words, just seeing something is true without thinking about it at all, is always faster than a deduction, which involves logic. And so this is an argument that has a profound impact on how we believe neural systems, human brains in particular, but neural systems compute.
When you talk about reaction time, you're not talking about the truth content of these things.
Yes, you are. So
the response, it needn't be right, but it'd be fast.
No, you are talking about the truth content. So the probe we used in the dissertation was what I called the had an effect upon, or I had an effect on probe. So you would ask a question like, did John have an effect on George? And The answer is yes, but we had experiments. Sometimes the answer was properly yes, sometimes it was properly no, sometimes it was the truth, and sometimes it wasn't the truth. And so we were asking within the context of just reading, of having read that sentence, or the sentence pairs, who caused to who. The dissertation goes into all the details.
Yeah.
So the answer is no. This amount of time it takes to confirm that something is true or false.
Yeah. Okay.
The argument is that this could have gone either way. If you were looking at a computer program written on a regular computer using what's called a rule system, the time that it takes to intuit something versus to logically compute something, the logical computation will almost always be faster than the induction. The induction will take a lot of time for the rule system to say, yeah, that's a real chair. Whereas your brain just looks at it and goes, it's a chair. It's not because the brain is not doing more computations. It's doing a lot of computations to figure out that it's such one, and everything is logical deduction. There's no automatic induction. You could argue that when you type on a keyboard, about the only thing the computer induces is what keys you typed. That you could argue is an induction and not a logical operation, although if you actually look at how the computer does it, it's a logical operation. It takes time. What was important about this study was, and we had, I don't know how many hundreds of these sentence pairs, but given a sentence juxtaposition like the cook threw the knife, John ducked, how is it that people readily see the cook throwing the knife caused Don to duck? Somebody can say it didn't prove it, and we say, yes, it didn't prove it, but everybody pretty much will say, yes, John ducked because the cook threw the knife. Okay. How did that happen? There was nothing that said explicitly that John ducked because the cook threw the knife. This is also the basis for how you manipulate people with conspiracy theories. So if you want to brainwash, I don't know, 50 million people, you lay the causation out where they are imagining it. So you may not actually assert the things they come to the belief themselves. And so they believe that they saw it. And they may notice that you didn't really say it, but once you told the people what happened and then what happened after that, they think that they saw it and they learned that very well. So part of this study, or actually half the study, was recall. And so the part of the study was this probing to see how fast people could make these. The second half of the study was recall. And we showed that recall of causation, perceived or inferred causation, was incredibly good. And people would remember things for days to do with inferred causation. In other words, conspiracy theories work because the conspiracy is left to be inferred and not logically arrived at. But the inference is hires to construct these things where you're inferring things. Like one of the classics with Trump is he makes it known that he knows stuff that you don't. You say, oh yeah, he's rich, or he's the president or something. He must know stuff that I don't know. And so he'll put things together. He won't exactly say it, but all of a sudden you know that he did let you know that these two things happened in a row, and you're pretty much, you say he knew what he was talking about, so it must be true, but it's a complete lie. Yet he never lied. Every word he said was true. So you could observe the cook throwing the knife and John ducking. You could say those are both asserted to be true. But the fact that John ducked because the cook threw the knife, that's inferred. This is at the heart of conspiracy theories that we have today, and so forth and so on. What we found, this is also the basis for believing that the The fundamental unit of neural computation is a predication. The idea is if you have a compute unit and you have a bunch of inputs, like 3,000 inputs, some of the units are a subject, some of the units are a predicate. The output is a recognition that the subject predicate pair has truth value. And typically, unless you think it's a deceit, it's true within the context that it's been stated. And the context itself is a predication on the predications. So it's always predication. A Stanford professor named Bauer and a student named John R. Anderson in 1973 suggested that there were propositional boundaries to human recognition processes of predication. What we were doing was we were basically saying, well, you're a predication engine, and the intuition to see how things are intuited, look at the predications and how the memory for the predications come out of the predications themselves, not out of deductive logic. Even though there's deductive, in this particular case, you can generate the logic that would back this with an assumption that John ducked because the guy threw the knife. In this Medium article and in the basically the first couple of pages of the dissertation, this book is available in Kindle. You can download a 30-day free reading or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Also, under the Kindle thing, if you have something called Kindle Unlimited, then it's a per page you read charge. If you're like me and you're very unlikely to read the whole thing, then and all you want to do is just look over the whole thing and then maybe read a few pages. Kindle Unlimited is a great way to do it because you only get charged $1 or $2. The Kindle version is the way to do it. The paperback version, they really do deliver these things in 3 days. It's amazing. So I'm making an argument that inductive reasoning is always faster than deductive reasoning in humans. And that's because we're intuition engines. We are not logic engines. Now, in having said that, we've known for many years that with an intuition engine alone, I can do logic. So I don't need a computer. Intuition engines themselves can turn themselves into computers and compute just like computers, or do math just like people do math, and so forth and so on. So what's crazy is that logic engines often cannot do intuition because they lack the evidence and they lack the intuition, the direct perception. Well, they don't have access to the right data. But the inverse is not true. All intuition engines can do any form of logic that a person is capable of doing, which is another really strong case for our brains are basically intuition engines, not logic engines. And that's both power to us because it allows us to survive, because we can respond very quickly to things that appear to be true that might kill us if they are true, and then we don't jump. And we see this as fundamental to any small neural system. And contrary to popular belief, this is not my opinion. This is my scientific judgment based on real experiments.
But there's still a question of how the information is marshaled for the quicker access, isn't it?
It's the massive computation by hundreds of millions of these little engines. It's mostly activation, like 96% activation and about 5% inhibition. An activation will cause something to be inhibited 5% of the time, but most of it is just activation. And then the activation is what's called sigmoid activation. It can't go through the roof. It just goes up and then flattens out. So it gets a lot of activity and then it flattens out. So it never, you can imagine that if you got two neurons that talk to each other with little electrical spikes, you can't make the spikes go very fast. The chemistry won't let the spikes can only go so fast. So there's a natural what's called a sigmoid effect, which is an S. So the activation can go up really fast, but then it levels off at a high speed, and then these activation bursts cannot sustain themselves for very long. And we're talking a few seconds, not minutes. Okay. So the brain is constantly doing this stuff, and it's doing on such a massive scale. And yes, for Brian, there was an experiment done by Stanford graduate student who was my age at the time, where he studied exactly what you just talked about, which is sometimes the intersentence relations. It's Bransford, Bransford, and Johnson, 1973, where he studied the amount of reasoning that gets induced, but people will still be able to answer the causation question really fast, but then it may start dawning on them that there's complexity to that causation, and people do that too. Okay, just like they can do logic even though they're induction engines. Now, there's been a lot on the topic since 1973, but as I've said before, there's only about 200 of us in the world that are still alive, and there's probably never been more than 200 people. It is a small scientific community, and we don't do things that make a lot of money for people until we did all this ChatGPT stuff, and then nobody gives us credit, which is okay. What I'm going to do is do the trial, and I'm arguing this is the truth. I just think it's the truth, and I actually give you scientific studies that you can replicate, and we know these have been replicated. I got hired based on this dissertation by a Nobel Prize laureate at CMU. His name is Herb Simon, and this dissertation was worthy enough that they hired me into the faculty at Carnegie Mellon. So there were people who understood what I was doing, even though most people hadn't had a clue. Is it the truth? I said yes. Is it, excuse me, is it the whole truth? I said no. There are situations where the law will not apply, just like Newton's laws don't apply in situations where friction may be present and not measured. In other words, I can slow you down in your intuition. For example, one of the cheap tricks to do it, which is like friction for gravity, is I can add something. And the simple thing for me to add is, I don't want you to just say yes or no. I want you to prove it to yourself that I'm right. Say that, it'll slow them down. Is the whole truth. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, the ways people can get slowed down. Is it nothing but the truth? I said yes. What's the deceit? I argue that there's no deceit here. Scientists expect to be disproven. Is the deceit of truth intended? Yes, I fully intended this. What's the motivation behind the truth or lie? It's to be informative. I thought this was a particularly important study for this situation we're currently in because of the conspiracy theories that are out there, and this tells you why they work. If you read the whole dissertation, it's like reading a book on it. What's the social acceptability of the truth or lie? Science, so I think it's acceptable. What label would improve it? I think I said no label. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to call out the jurors, and I would like to get each juror to give me a 20 to 30-second summary of their verdicts.
Did you ever study swapping the two sentences around?
I'm sorry?
Did you ever study swapping your two sentences that you used?
I've tried it. So these were real serious experiments. So the right answer is that there were many conditions studied, and the answer is yes. So if you read the first few chapters of the dissertation, That's explicitly discussed.
Right. If you had John ducked and the cook threw the knife, you're really implying that there's a third person, say, in the room, and they're both reacting to that presence. It's a very different
Yeah.
cognitive level, isn't it?
But it's still intuition because it wasn't stated. And so it's intuition that may cause them to slow down because it's not in the right order a little bit, but it's still intuition that they're inferring the causation. And the right answer is, again, you could construct the circumstances under which this law doesn't hold. But under all this is discussed in the dissertation. It gets really to go through all these. So juror one.
To give a summary, I would think to say that people spot truth or lies faster by using examples like the gut feeling or intuition rather than using step-by-step thinking. The case says this is always true, and I agree with the case.
Thanks. Juror two.
Just a brief summary. I
Yes,
said
just a brief. Yeah.
I said based on the analysis, the markup is the truth, but not the whole truth. It is true that humans tend to perceive truths or lies faster through inductive reasoning because it operates on intuition, experience, and immediate pattern recognition. Deductive reasoning, on the other hand, involves a slower, step-by-step logical process that cannot happen in a single perception or action. However, the truth does not account for the accuracy, where deductive reasoning often performs better. So while the statement is truthful in its claim about speed, it lacks completeness regarding the trade-off between speed and reliability.
The only thing I'd add to that, which is why it's that way, it's evolutionary. Since this is something that we believe happens in dogs and all animals, I think dogs can think logically if pressed. In most survival situations, if you can't make a truth or deceit judgment quickly, you might be dead. From an evolutionary point of view, even though brains could operate on logic, they don't, because they can operate faster on intuition, where all the elements of a logical conclusion can't be made in a short period of time. The reason it's so built into us and you can't take it out of a human, he doesn't exist. He's a figment of somebody's imagination. Just saying. Okay, juror three.
Good evening, everybody. To give my overview on my opinion, I would just say that induction is faster when it comes to recognizing truths or lies, as it relies on instinct patterns or prior experience. However, I believe, like I think Juror 2 stated, that deduction is a more advanced and reliable method. While it may take more time, deduction provides a more deeper and consistent understanding of what is true or false. Yeah, thank you, guys.
Yeah, so I agree with that. The only thing that you need to see is that deduction is actually a subset of induction. It's a set of inductions. So one of the things that you induce is that the logic was perfect. And this was originally observed by Descartes in 1600 when he was introducing his method for rules of evidence in law and modern science. His example was Euclid and Euclid's geometric proofs. The way he said it was beautiful. And this is when you had to be able to read Latin and so forth. And if you've ever looked at Euclid's proofs, you can't follow them. Each proof is its own little world of logic. It's not like you're taught geometry today. Euclid's proofs are perfect geometric proofs, but another little logical system. And what's interesting is that what Descartes said was that we recognize perfect, we can intuitively see perfect logic. So when we press ourselves to want to make sure that something is absolutely for sure true. Our intuition engine does that. We do not have a logic engine. It's emergent out of our intuition engine, which is crazy. So these are not two systems that we have inside our brains. It's one system. Juror 4.
Hi, everyone. I definitely agree with what the plaintiff is saying, what the host is saying. Your brain works in ways that whatever reaction that it has experienced or it has gone through, it is able to make a much more quicker and much more faster reaction as opposed to dealing with a situation that may not be exactly familiar. Although the other one takes much more longer and it takes much more thinking, much more concentration, it still more or less gives the same result, but the only account that we have for is just speed and how the brain is able to say whether this is true or false based on either past experience or not having past experience because it's an unfamiliar territory or situation. So that's my stance.
The only other thing to add is that from an evolutionary point of view, we also know how to trust somebody. So if we trust somebody, we will accept something they say where we may not trust something from somebody who you don't trust. And that's built in too. So I don't know how many of y'all have dogs, but I like dogs. You can trust your dog. That's when it's saying things to you, pretty much, unless you know that it's lying to you, you can trust what it's saying. But the point is that trust comes in there too. Trust is another intuition that you intuit, but you can trust this person. And on that basis, you may believe something is true, when in fact, if it had been said by anybody else, you might not have believed it. So Juror 5, is Juror 5 here?
I don't see a Juror 5 yet.
Juror 6?
Good evening, everyone. So I would say I agree with the Maka. The brain is wired to perceive the truth and the truth through our collective experiences. It's harder to deduce what actually the truth is, the actual logical, the actual truth is. Let me say that again. It's harder to deduce the actual truth through logic because it's hard for the human brain to not internalize what they experience through the senses with what they have experienced in the past.
That's true. So that's called bias. Okay.
Yeah.
In my world, and there's one of the things that turns out to be very real is everybody is biased. Even if you think you're unbiased, you probably aren't, because there'll be things that you will believe because your intuition engine is just saying this is true, when in fact, it's not true. And even if you were forced to prove it, you might go through hoops to prove that it was true, but all you're doing is showing off your bias. So it's really interesting to see how the brain has been evolved so that it can handle logic, but at the same time.
Is it safe to say even someone like a detective who has a set of rules, even they have a battle with perception and deduction in the psyche?
So I've been around a long time, had thousands of students. Everybody is really good at this stuff. You have to basically be incapacitated before you're not really brilliant in terms of figuring out what the truth and lies are. People underestimate other people all the time. Juror 7.
Good day, everyone. My verdict is essentially our gut instincts work faster than logic thought. But while intuition may be quicker, it isn't always as accurate or thorough as logical reasoning. In a sense, I'm not sure if I'm going to use a good example, but let's say I would go for an interview, right? As much as I would be prepared for some of the questions that they might ask me, there are questions that are gonna catch me off guard, and in that sense, I have to use my intuition to answer as accurately and as quickly as possible. But then, let's say when I get home, I'm gonna go back and be like, yo, I could have said this, I could have said that. So yeah, that's essentially what I was thinking. Thank you.
I think that's a good answer. Are we on Juror 8 now? Juror 8?
Yeah, we're on Juror 8.
Yes, I'm on Juror 8. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'll have to concur with saying that intuition is far faster than actually logic. Logic only kicks in afterwards. And it is true that I'm also a scientist, actually a retired school teacher, and also I hold a metaphysics degree as well, so I know what you're talking about. And 5 years is a long time for the acceptance of your...
I was escaping Vietnam.
Yes. Yeah, 5 years is quite a long time. There's other topics that takes even more than 5 years, 20 or 25 years, but that's for another day. My question that I also like to, was a study done solely on adults? Was other factors, you spoke about Newton as well and about other factors like friction. Was other factors considered when the studies was done? What about genetics, and what about the age of the brain as well? Doesn't
if you
that
want
play
a copy of, if you want a copy of the dissertation, I go through lots of that stuff. So I wrote this in 1975, 76. I don't have a perfect memory, but there's a lot of prior work, and there's a lot. One of the fundamentals of what I was doing, which is actually what I got a name for, was I was using inferences that everybody agreed on as direct observation in a scientific sense. So if I could say, did John have an effect on George or whatever, and you said yes, and everybody said yes, that was observable. That inference in their brains was observable by a scientist and could be studied as science. That's worked against the popular belief that on what people think.
The other thing that you also mentioned is quite true, is that intuition can actually save your life. Sometimes we do things without thinking, and that's intuition, and it can actually save your life and others' lives as well if you're driving a car, actually. Then logic kicks in. Logic kicks in afterwards. That's what I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I really appreciate it. If you sent me to support a request for the dissertation, I could probably send you a link since you're a scientist. You might actually find the experiments interesting to see how I did the controls. Okay, so this sounds great.
Good trial, Bob. Good trial.
Are there any other questions and so forth?
Are we still on the one plaintiff, one juror run still?
Yeah, we still are, and Justin is on vacation this week, so I can't change it right away. But we're working on improving this stuff, and I am really working on getting some sponsors in so that we can fund the numbers trials that we could support. We could probably support, believe it or not, 1,000 trials a day with the number of people that we have wanting to be jurors and so forth. Okay, so this sounds great.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.